we have assisted me in the opining, two of my regulars, my titans of tumult, if you will. First, Bob Weiner, Robert Weiner, if you will, Democratic strategist, columnist, and former communications director for Clinton drug czar General Barry McCaffrey. He's also former communications director for Congressman Rangel and Conyers of New York and Michigan, respectively. Bob, good to have you back.
Good to be with you, Alan, and you ought to just listen to Mitt Romney, who will tell you what happens to Republicans who oppose health care.
Yes, that's if they were opposing his style of health care versus the one we've had foisted upon us. Amy Ridenour joins us as well, chairman of the National Center for Public Policy Research. Amy, good to have you back.
Thank you, Alan.
Good to have you, good to have you. And, of course, there's a number of things we forget as it relates to Romney Care, but we'll get to that in a little bit. In the meantime, what I'd like to go do is chat a little bit about what we just heard. Bob, first to you. We were listening to Jonathan Karl. And it kind of reminds me, because in the world of politics, it seems that direction and momentum can often change quite rapidly. Now, when you heard Karl speak, first of all, do you think he's right that now, for the most part, the country has forgotten about the shutting down of the government and is now far more preoccupied with the Obamacare botched rollout? And secondly, will the media's current focus on Obamacare perhaps jump to something else? Or is there simply too much pending damage to keep reporting? Bob Weiner.
Well, I know Fox would love the attention to shift from the fact that Terry McAuliffe is going to be a huge winner largely because of the shutdown. But let me just point out that it has not changed in terms of Obamacare. A new poll out today by Kaiser shows that by 47 to 37, Congress should expand the law or keep it as it is rather than repeal it. So as Mitt Romney said to Fox right after the election when he said that he lost largely because people don't realize that a lot of the opposition to the bill is people who want to expand it, not kill it, then the Republicans, I hope they keep digging their grave on this because it caused Romney a lot of grief, as he himself said.
Intriguing. Well, one thing I'd like to clarify, first of all, the difference between Romney Care and Obamacare is that, number one, we didn't have 18 to 20 new taxes with Romney Care. Number two, you had 198 to 2 supporting it in a very bipartisan fashion. I don't think there was any dissenting votes in the Massachusetts Senate.
That's true.
And, of course, that law didn't require pilfering $500 billion from Medicare in order to sustain it. So when you look at the disparities between the two bills, it seems intellectually disingenuous for anybody in support of Obamacare to use Romney Care as any kind of justification whatsoever without looking pretty silly. Amy, to you.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you. And I'd like to point out, too, that Bob has probably had in the last year or so about 19 or 20 different reasons why Romney lost, each one conveniently going with the subject of the day on the radio show. He lost for quite a few reasons, some of which had to do with turnout in various states in their own political operation. But when it comes to health care, people want a good health insurance policy. There are now millions of Americans who believe they had a good health insurance policy at a price they were at least satisfied with, and they have lost it because of Obamacare. That's a big deal. People will continue to care about this for a couple of reasons. One is those particularly who are concerned about health care, and that's separate from insurance, are going to be worried about the fact that it's very difficult to replace this insurance right now because the website is not working. It's not impossible to replace. You can go outside of the website, but it's very difficult, which is stressful. It is also the case that these stories of sick people, like the poor lady who has a stage 4 cancer who's in the Wall Street Journal today, and who the White House attacked erroneously, trying to defend themselves, who lost her plan in California. These are stories that the media will find attractive because they are human interest stories. This is not a story about green eye shades. And it's going to continue for months and months at minimum. So, yeah, the left is in trouble here. And it's in trouble due to its own fault because it pushed through a health care, quote-unquote, reform policy that works less well than the system it's bumping out.
This is intriguing as hell when you think about it. Guys, I tell you what, let's pause for a moment. Derek, if you wouldn't mind, I want to hear clips 6 and 8. Now, the first one is going to be ABC's Jonathan Karl saying that there is no good explanation for the website's failure. And after that, you're going to hear ABC's Matthew Dowd also negatively commenting on the administration. Both of these folks are reasonably receptive to the Obama administration, especially Matthew Dow. Jonathan Karl actually had Jay Carney on the ropes today, but I don't have time to get into that. Derek, if you please, clips 6 and 8.
They don't have a good explanation behind the scenes either. I mean, and George, we sat through presentations before this went online, just days before it went online, top people at the White House talking to us about how amazing this website was going to be. And it was not just, oh, this is one portal where you can sign up for the health care plan. This was what it was all about.
And the problem for the president is, though, that on competence is 1 time is a fluke, 2 times is a coincidence, 3 times is a trend. And when every response to every major crisis, you say, I didn't know what was going on, or the president didn't know what was going on, that builds a trend that is not good for the president.
So, Bob, let me ask you, is the excuse, I'm too uninformed to be responsible, really much of a winning argument?
No. Alan, I don't know what part of they should have load tested it before they launched it. They don't understand, but of course they should have. There is no good explanation, and it is true that Obama needed to be informed about that. But having said that, Amy, there were 3 cases that Fox used, and all 3, when they were interviewed, it was nonsense, and they could have gotten cheaper care insurance under the plan. So you can find 1 on one side, 3 on the other. So that's point. Okay, let me finish. And on the other side, this thing, when it's fixed, it's going to be like Part D, and it's going to be like Romney Care, which had 123 the entire first month. It's going to be completely forgotten now that Romney Care has 99%.
But what about the reality that the president was caught red-handed lying? There was this NBC News report by Lisa Myers and Hannah Rapoport over Lisa Myers and Hannah Rapoport. Now, the Obama administration apparently knew all along that millions of Americans would be losing their current health care despite the president's assurances to the contrary. Look, Lisa Myers said it herself. Here's a little bit of the text. Buried in Obamacare regulations from July 2010 is an estimate that because of normal turnover in the individual insurance market, 40 to 67% of customers will not be able to keep their policy, and because many policies will have been changed since the key date, the percentage of individual market policies losing grandfather status in a given year exceeds the 40 to 67% range. These guys knew the real deal. They advertised the opposite. How is that not a permanent blemish on their credibility?
It is. But they also should have said that if it doesn't meet the standards, you'll have to get another policy, and it's going to be better and it can be cheaper in many cases. He should have said that. He didn't say that. That is a blemish.
Yes, but most of the insurance gurus are saying, if anything, when the policies do add on these additional items, it will not be at a cheaper rate. It'll be more expensive, because the bottom line is you can't add 30 million uninsured people, all for everybody, and require everybody to have more coverage and more services and have the net result not be an overall increase in cost. To think otherwise is to stretch credulity to the snapping point, actually to the point of
Bottom line, guys, 3.5 years to execute the central promise and the central meaning of your own administration, and it flops. You almost have to try to fail with 3.5 years, I got to tell you.
Parts of it can be delayed, and even parts of it can be repealed, incidentally, much more than seemed possible a month ago. Think a month ago, how crazy is it for Ted Cruz to say that we should delay the individual mandate? How crazy is it for Republicans to say that premiums might go up? And now, all of a sudden, Democratic senators and congressmen are saying, gee, we have a big problem.
They didn't get the Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi full loaf. They got about 55% of the loaf. And as a result of them ramming it through reconciliation, it set the tone. And then when we went through the amendment process, they didn't allow for one amendment to actually try to fix the errors that they recognized that were a problem. A lot of the stuff that's happening, the reason my blood was boiling, because they're basically misleading the voters. I'd say they're lying about what's fact and what's fiction, and it's wrong. And the people deserve better.
Welcome back, everybody. Every year is Alan Nathan, the militant moderate. Once again, this is the oasis for those who have an aversion to the left, right, black, white, two-dimensional approach. You were just listening, the last voice you heard was former Senator Brown from Massachusetts, Republican type, saying that Obamacare didn't have widespread support, so it had to be rammed through. Then they would not allow for an amendment process. He also notes that they're lying to the voters about all of this. He was referring to the lies when they referenced comparisons to Massachusetts health care, of which Senator Brown had been a participant in bringing about. He said they forget that, first of all, unlike Obamacare, you didn't have 18 to 20 new taxes. They didn't have to use over $500 billion from Medicare to fund it. You had unanimous support in the state Senate. You had 198 to 2 support for the health care law. And these areas just in and of themselves are proof positive that whenever people try to draw comparisons between the two, they're simply misrepresenting the facts. And then, of course, when you expose those facts, then they backpedal, but they'll still try to take the shot up until you pull the rug out from under them. And, of course, before that, we were listening to, well, NBC's Meet the Press. You're hearing Bill Kristol, editor, one of the editors of the Weekly Standard, talking about how it's possible to delay and repeal parts of Obamacare based on how recently it seemed that Senator Cruz was admonished for it. It is very strange that you now have Democrats considering and contemplating the very thing Republicans were scorned for even bringing up. And just before that, you heard the Wall Street Journal's Peggy Noonan on ABC's This Week as well, noting that with 3.5 years to implement Obamacare, the administration almost had to try to fail. We have assisting me in the opining my regular titans of tumult, Amy Ridenhour, chairman of the National Center for Public Policy, also Bob Weiner, Democratic strategist and columnist. Amy, let me go to you on this one. I was bringing this up before, but as reported last week by NBC News, Lisa Myers and this Hannah Rapoli, the Obama administration apparently was exposed as having known all along that millions of Americans would be losing their current health care despite the president's guarantees to the opposite or assurances to the contrary. I already spoke about that, but what the Manhattan Institute's Avik Roy had to say when writing in Forbes magazine was the following. He said, contrary to the reporting of NBC, the administration's commentary in the Federal Register did not only refer to the individual market, but also the market for employer-based sponsored health insurance. So that all totaled now, 93 million Americans can wind up having their insurance canceled. And again, this would be with the Obama administration's full knowledge of it, even though they were concurrently making promises to the contrary. So, Amy, I got to ask you, even if they fix this website, how will fixing that website ever fix this even larger problem? Amy Ridenhour.
It will not fix the larger problem. It will help somewhat for the people who wish to go there and who get health insurance and those who get subsidies. And we're not even talking now about paying for those subsidies, but who get subsidies. There will be a few people who feel that they are personally better off. That said, Avik Roy is absolutely right. We are looking at near to 100 million people who will have different health insurance, whether they like it or not, by 2015. This doesn't even include, he's actually underballing it because he's not talking about the people on Medicare who will no longer be able to see the doctors that in some cases, as in the story out of New York City last week, that they have seen for 20 years. We're also having more shoes drop down in the future because Medicaid is expanding in certain states. And unfortunately, when you expand Medicaid, you do not just ipso facto expand the number of doctors who are practicing medicine. In fact, if anything, Obamacare is scaring people away from going to medical school. So you will have more people trying to see the same or fewer number of doctors under a Medicaid system that, number one, is under tremendous financial strain, and number two, already is reimbursing doctors in many cases at a lower level than they need to stay in business, because doctors have a lot of expenses.
Bob Weiner, what's your take on these things?
Well, God, where to start? First of all, reconciliation is democracy. It means instead of 60 votes, you need 50. And I'm very proud that I was helpful in reversing Rahm, Baucus, and Reed on that through a radio row where we said call them all and tell them you want to vote and use the democratic process. Second of all, Scott Brown was mad that we did because he was in the Senate for about a minute when we used reconciliation, so his vote wouldn't count particularly.
But Bob, you'll admit that when you use that reconciliation, though, you'll admit that denied the House from weighing in with counter counters that it had, many counters from the Democratic side of the aisle, as it related to a Senate bill that they just were not all that delighted with.
Yeah, because
but the alternative would have been to let the House weigh in with their amendments, let it go up to a House Senate Conference Committee. But you guys didn't want to do that because that then would have required the vote to go back to the Senate, which would have been batted down because Scott Brown then would have had the power to vote against it, he being the 41st vote. Isn't that fair to say?
You mean the 41st on a filibuster?
Right.
What I have to say is that the House would have gone public option, but the House knew enough to take what they could get. Third of all, Brown's point about premiums. Premiums are 16% lower than what they were expected to be. Fourth of all, no amendments. Yeah, Brown didn't see them, but there were 160 amendments in committee.
What they're expected to be is a fake measure. What they're expected to be is a fake measure. The only thing that matters is what they are compared to what they have been. What you're saying, it's not as bad as we envision, that's a floating measure. By that standard, you could essentially get away with saying anything, anytime you want, never be held to account, because something could always be less than originally anticipated. Hey, you know what, guys? I'm looking at the clock. I got to ask you a question. And this is something that I don't want this from both of you. I need this.
Final point, Alan.
Go ahead.
I have to make it, which is, if this were under Bush, you talk about the vote in the Massachusetts Senate, the legislature, it would have been 98-2 if Bush had offered this bill, which it could have been because this was Dole's health bill.
No,
it's unfortunate.
Okay.
It's unfortunate that the federal health care bill of Obama's is so disparate from the one referenced by Scott Brown that your summary is undercut by those foundational facts. But I'm looking at the time, and I got to go on to something else. And I want to ask you both this. Amy, to you. And here's something I'm hearing from no one, but I think we might eventually start hearing because it does go to the law's functionality. You heard how these folks are desperately in need of the young to make this plan work. If you can't get them, forget it. It's not going to happen.
The invincible.
You need them. You need their dollars to take care of the older and the sicker. Now, since the Affordable Care Act allows the young invincibles to stay covered by their parents' insurance plans until they're 26 years old, Amy, won't that dynamic potentially work against getting that same age group to populate the exchanges necessary to make the program solvent?
Well, of course it does. Now, the numbers were crunched knowing about the age 26 thing, so it makes it a harder hurdle. I think the Obama folks were extremely confident several years ago that all this would be very easy, that execution was the easy part, getting it through Congress was the hard part. Well, we're seeing now execution is the hard part, and as hard as getting it through Congress was, that actually is turning out to have been the easy part. So you're right, and they will probably fail. And this will only be part of the reason.
Bob, to you, I want your honest answer now. I don't know that you've ever been asked this question before, so maybe give it a little bit of thought. But think about it. Forget about the liberal and the conservative and the centrist here on the air right now.
You know I talk truth, so go ahead.
Let's look at this. If you have, in fact, since the Affordable Care Act allows the younger folks to stay covered by their parents' plans till they're 26, won't that dynamic potentially work against getting that same age group to populate the exchanges really necessary to keep this program solvent, Bob Weeman?
But that isn't the age that they were factoring in. They were factoring in under 45. So that's the reality of the math.
Oh, so the idea that ages 26 down to 18 are no longer there to contribute to the fiscal...
Well, they are. It's part of a family plan. It's bought that way. But the age that you're calculating, Alan, is the 45 minus, not the 26 minus.
Okay, looking at the clock one last time for giggles. I can't resist. I can't help myself. Derek, if you please, number 25.
Does Obamacare mandate that insurance companies change their plans to meet certain standards?
Yes, it brings it up. But we grandfathered in all the pre-existing plans. If you want to change plans or you want to buy a new car, you have to meet safety standards.
But
that was the rule.
Wait. But wait a minute. Your grandfathering is so narrow. For instance,
it's not so narrow.
Let me give you an example. For instance, if an insurance company changes the copay by more than $5 over the course of the 3 years since 2010, it's no longer grandfathered in.
That's usually a 25% change. That's a big change. You have
a $5 change in the copay. Now it's not grandfathered.
You have to ask the question: how many planks do you change in a boat before it's a different boat?